Welcome to the Multifaceted Executive, the podcast where leadership meets diversity, innovation, and impact. We go beyond boardrooms and titles to bring you powerful stories and insights from executives of all backgrounds. Get ready to challenge conventional thinking, gain fresh perspectives, and discover the leadership lessons you won't hear anywhere else. I'm your host, Amanda Cosme Reddy, founder and CEO of the Multifaceted Executive and Take Brand Consulting. Let's get started. Welcome to the Multifaceted Executive Podcast. I'm your host and the founder of the Multifaceted Executive and Take Brand Consulting. My name is Amanda Cosme Reddy, and I'm here with Allison Quintanilla Platzmeyer. In this podcast, you can come whether you want to hear different voices or perspectives across things that matter in verticals like the nonprofit, entrepreneurship, and corporate America. And for our third episode, I want us to really dive into Allison's experience. And so if this is your first time, I want you to have a true understanding of what a multifaceted executive is. A multifaceted executive is a leader that has many facets. They're not defined by any particular industry, background, or leadership style, but rather their ability to adapt, inspire, and create impact across different spaces. Allison, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I would like to invite you to share a little bit more about yourself before we jump into our conversation on collaboration over competition.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Allison Quintanilla Platzmeyer. I am a Nashville native and still live in Nashville, one of the few that are still here with how much it's been booming. I knew that I wanted to work in the nonprofit sector since I was really young. My parents kind of raised me coming to volunteer events with them, and I just always knew that that's what I wanted to do. I believe that my calling is to make a difference in the lives of other people, and I love fundraising. I love building relationships, and I believe that if anybody's a strengths finder person, connector is one of mine. And so I love being able to meet people and say, hey, have you met this person? And really pull people behind a passion and a cause. And so that's really what's driven my career to this point.
I love that. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about yourself. And I think you and I have agreed we're both servant leaders, and servant leaders show up a lot in the nonprofit space, especially when it comes to doing things like fundraising, connecting with people. Not everybody is comfortable with that. And in our conversations, I know that you've shared that you're actually pursuing an advanced certified fundraising executive credential, or ACFRE, and that I believe only about 120 people hold that type of certificate. So what's driving you to take on that kind of rigor?
Yeah. So I'm just somebody that if I don't know something, I'm gonna go learn it, right? That I've been a lifelong learner. I just love really delving into new things and challenging myself. The ACRFRE is the pinnacle for the fundraising profession. You have to have 10 years of full-time fundraising experience, which I just hit. And it really allows you to look at where the gaps in your skill set might be. So there's 4 steps. You have to do an application, which is going through everything that you've done in your career so far, which was actually quite difficult for me because I have been doing a lot of things. I've always been doing full-time in the nonprofit sector, plus consulting, plus teaching, and I work in small shops. So I'm usually, I might be at a place like for 4 months, 6 months. So 10 years of piecing together every place I've ever worked, every project I've ever done was quite the endeavor. It took me, I think it was 76 pages was how long my application was. And I'm really into continuing education. So I have done a bachelor's, 3 masters, and 2 doctorates. And most of those were in the last 5 years. And so I was like, oh, well, I have to include some of that coursework and some of my conference stuff and some of the things that I've taught, even though that was way above the point total in each section. My mentor was like, it helps to show the diversity of the experiences within each area. So you have to have like a certain number of hours in advanced leadership, advanced management, and advanced ethics. So that's step 1. I have submitted that and I'm waiting for the panel to get back on that. And then we have
Hey.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm super excited. And then we have a portfolio section where we have to go through like a strategic plan that we've created, a management document like a board handbook or an employee handbook or a volunteer recruitment strategy, a creative section, graphics that we've designed or videos that we've put together. And then writing, so technical writing that we've done or publications that we've submitted. So that will be the second step, is putting together that portfolio piece. And then we have a written exam and an oral exam. So my hope is that we can be done by October, because it has to be structured around when the AFP does their annual conferences. But I'm pretty sure if I get it, I would actually also be the youngest ACFRE as well, because the last one was 33. So
Wow, that is incredible. So, congratulations first and foremost. 10 years is a long time and well deserved for you to really be going after this type of certification, and I'm sure you're gonna get it. It sounds like it's a rigorous process, and for good reason, right? That's probably why only a certain amount of people hold this type of certification, because it's for people like you that really want to show up and show like, hey, this is what I've done, and be able to demonstrate that through your certification and even going through the process. I'm really happy and I'm proud of you for going through that experience. And I think even kind of going back to earlier where I mentioned for the audience what a multifaceted executive is, like you said, you're a teacher, you're a consultant, you help in so many different areas, and to be going after such a great achievement like this, huge kudos to you for that.
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I have talked previously also about collaboration over competition. And so I want people to really have a better understanding of what that looks like. And so when you say collaboration, I know that it's not just the strategic aspect. You really look at this as a movement. And so, share a little bit around how this belief shapes your identity as a servant leader, especially when you are in the trenches with your team.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really believe that the purpose of the nonprofit sector is to give back, and that people that are in this work, it's not about them, right? It's about the people that we serve. And unfortunately, I do feel like in the nonprofit sector, I say the good news is anybody can start a nonprofit. The bad news is anybody can start a nonprofit. And so you often see people that their heart is in the right place, but they might not know how to actually like run the organization. So they're the really passionate people that are great at being boots on the ground, but they're unable to like get the fundraising that they need or get the support they need to actually like carry the mission through. And so you see this often in the nonprofit sector is like founder syndrome. They want to be the only person that does it. And that often works to the detriment of the people that they're trying to serve, because they may not have the skill set or they may not have the networks, right? And that's where that collaboration piece really comes into play. You can say, hey, who do I know that's connected to this network? Maybe it's worth opening my sphere to allow partnership with these people, because it will ultimately further the mission. But I found that in general, there's been like a little bit of ego in terms of like not being willing to let go of the reins, or being so focused on who gets the credit for something that ultimately like holds the mission back. And so that's something that I've been working on in Nashville, is looking at, we have so many nonprofits. We have 2,800 in Middle Tennessee alone. And so I think it's the purpose of funders or conveners like membership organizations like the Center for Nonprofit Excellence that see everybody that's working in the sphere and saying, okay, we have 56 nonprofits that are working for substance abuse prevention. Let's get them all in a room and say, hey, together you guys have $10 million that you're raising every year, but together you're spending $6 million trying to run 56 different organizations. What would this look like if we were to consolidate or, make some of these costs aligned, and that would allow us to free up, $2 million towards the mission that would move the needle more. But it's often that the organizations are not willing to like have those conversations. So one thing we've been working on at ENP over the last 4 years is we have 5 nonprofits that are serving the Edgehill community, which is 1 square mile.
Okay.
And four of those nonprofits are under 150,000 and don't have any paid staff. And so it's like, again, if all 5 of us were working together, we'd be $1 million organization. We would probably have staff. We would be able to be providing a lot more value for the nonprofits or for the neighbors. And we've had 3 different funders say, hey, if you guys can just get everybody to the table and get everyone aligned on how we're going to serve the community with the assets that we have, we'd be willing to give multi-six-figure gifts to move the Edge Hill neighborhood forward. But even that, it's like, even when you go to them and say, hey, this is on the line, it's like, it gets lost in that, like, okay, but who gets to lead the charge? If you're
Right.
leading the charge, I don't want to do it. I want to be the one leading the charge, you know? And so I think that ultimately that collaboration over competition will get us further and get everyone what they need to put the focus back on the communities that we're serving.
That's a great point, and I couldn't agree more. There are honestly a few other examples, even if we think outside of nonprofit, right? You and I are both consultants. Consulting is rough right now. I think entrepreneurship is rough right now in this economy and what we're experiencing. But there are ways that we can collaborate even as consultants, right? There are areas and audiences that we share where we can come together and do meaningful work together and provide experiences that are just not out there, because usually everyone's doing their own thing, right? And so instead of looking at it as like every man for themselves or every woman for themselves, right? Like, how do we make sure that we're thinking strategically around how we can collaborate? And so I've been even thinking about that with my own consulting firm. Another example is in the nonprofit space, right? So there's a lot of nonprofits. One that I actually volunteer for, it's called Alpha. You're familiar with Alpha. You were also one of the recognized leaders for the Latinos to Watch Award. And so with Alpha, it's the Association of Latino Professionals for America. And there's a lot of other nonprofit organizations that are out there to empower Hispanic communities, Black, right? Different demographics in general. And a lot of the times what I'll see is people are hesitant to work with each other because it's like they're very protective of, this is my community, this is my strategy. But really, that shouldn't be the case. We're all supporting the same community, we're just doing it in a different way. And so if we can switch away from that we're all competition mindset to how can we collaborate with each other to actually make a greater impact, I'm right there with you. So do you see that a lot more so in EMP? And also tell us a little bit more about EMP. I don't think we got too much into it at the beginning, but tell us a little bit about EMP and your consulting firm and maybe kind of where you're seeing all of this within those areas. I know you touched a lot more on EMP with different partnerships that are happening there with those nonprofits, but feel free to either extend a little bit more or just share more about your consulting firm too.
Yeah, thank you. So I have been CEO of ENP since April of 21. ENP started as Edge Hill Neighborhood Partnership in 2008, and our mission is neighbors doing what neighbors do. We work for justice and equity for our neighbors through community service, action, and empowerment. So Edge Hill is a neighborhood where it used to be a bunch of thriving Black families. The government came and took a bunch of the houses via eminent domain under the guise that they were going to provide affordable housing, and ended up converting them into commercial lots. And then also the interstate ran through the neighborhood and split the neighborhood. And so now 40% of the residents live below the poverty line, despite the median home price now being $900,000. And so the neighborhood has really been left behind. So in 2011, we started the Free Store, where we provide items typically not covered by food stamps to the community. So a lot of hygiene and cleaning supplies. Edge Hill's also a food desert and a food swamp. So they've had a hard time recruiting a grocery store because of how bad the gentrification is now, that even if they could get a grocery store, it wouldn't be a grocery store that is affordable for the residents or the majority of residents at this point. So they've struggled to not have a grocery store. And then there's a fast food restaurant, every 100 feet basically. And so we worked in 2020 to start providing fresh produce and prepared meals as well. Over the last few years, we've expanded to the things that if you're just starting over, you might need, like kitchen appliances, small kitchen appliances, linens, dishes, things like that, as well as the things that if you're living paycheck to paycheck might be just out of reach. So we work with Nashville Food Project, Nashville Diaper Connection, Community Resource Center, Cultivate, One Gen Away, so that all of those resources are at the Free Store store, and they can get all of those in one place. We are client choice. So instead of getting a pre-packed box, they get to pick whatever they want within the quantity restrictions. That again preserves like dignity in the process, allows them to pick what they want. Because some people may say like, I only think you need to eat this, and it's like, why? Like, why do you get to control what their food decisions are? And so you've seen that in a non-cultural competence way. Like some may say, oh, I'm not going to give them any like ethnic food. I'm not going to give them anything spicy. They're not going to want Asian noodles. You can't make those decisions for people. We are client choice. They can pick whatever they want within the quantity restrictions. And then we also don't means test. So even though 100% of our shoppers identify as living below the poverty line, they don't have to prove it. They don't have to come and, bring income stubs. And that also allows us to serve people that maybe they're doing fine and then they have an unexpected medical bill or they have a sudden job loss and then they're in need. So we're very by the community for the community in that way. We also have an after-school program called The Spot that focuses on social emotional intelligence and helping youth transcend adverse childhood experiences and combat the toxic stress that comes from living in poverty, and finding trusted adult mentors. And it focuses on college prep and career exploration as well. And then we do affordable housing advocacy. So citywide, looking at community benefits agreements. So how can we get more assets into the community as developers are coming in, negotiating for direct hire jobs from the community, childcare options, food resources, looking at least 5 to 20% ideally of affordable housing units in every new development. And then on the other side, AQP Consulting, I work with small shops looking at their fundraising strategy, grant writing, strategic planning, and board development. So really looking at, I say, scale to sustainability. So how do you go from being that either volunteer executive director or first executive director to like building a team? Because getting over that hump of kind of like the first $500,000 is like a grind. So being able to understand how you can get and build like fundraising support in those early years is where I see a lot of nonprofits struggling.
Nice. Thank you for breaking that down. And you said a lot of things I want to touch on briefly because they're so important. So appreciate you sharing more about EMP. I think it's important that people know about that organization because, to your point, it kind of ties back to the theme of today's conversation, collaboration over competition. How do we collaborate together on what the needs are of the community? Not assuming what we think we know or going off of stereotypes or statistics or things that we think are going to make the company look better, but more so what are the needs of the actual community? Not enough people pay attention to what their community needs, whether that means they are people coming to you for support like this, maybe they're donors that are giving back to the community, or maybe it's a customer of yours that is not in the nonprofit space. We have to learn more about the needs of the people that we're serving. I also want to touch on the fact that within this consulting firm, you're helping people that you said don't necessarily meet a threshold, which is typical in local circumstances, right? Where people need food stamps or economic assistance, things like that. Speaking from personal experience, I'm gonna get a little vulnerable with my audience here. I was laid off from my job in August of last year, and everybody knows that when you are an entrepreneur, especially, right, you know that you don't make money right away. It's very rare when that happens. But at the same time, my husband makes just over the threshold on what is needed to actually get support from, our local resources. Now, you and I come from diverse backgrounds and we're both Latinas. We've shared, different views on how that's looked for us as we've progressed throughout our career. I know you've mentioned before that you're really what it means to be white passing. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that because I think it's also, I'm curious to know a little bit more about how that's, helped or not helped in terms of how you balance privilege with purpose and how that awareness has shown up in how you lead, advocate, and create space for others, especially as an executive in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to have a lot of self-awareness about the way that you show up in spaces and the spaces that you're getting access to. So I think a lot of people that are in, come from a majority background, they really just don't realize how much things come easy to them. They think I worked really hard to do things. It's like, but you don't realize that you got into like 80% more of the doors that people would if they looked differently wouldn't have if they looked differently from you. I think I've had to realize in terms of like I do have the privilege of identifying as Latina. Like I can tell or not tell people that I'm Latina just based on looks. But I think that I have kind of a dual perspective of both knowing what it means to be perceived as that majority and getting the access to that, but also knowing what my family has experienced. And, I have been discriminated against when they saw like Quintanilla or after I told them the change in their behavior. Like I remember one role that I came into, I was like, oh yeah, I'm Latina. They're like, oh, we need one of you on the board. We've been struggling to get Latinos on the board. Or um, he was talking about something and he said, yeah, this Mexican came into the clinic the other day. And I'm like, well, how do you know they were Mexican? Brown, whatever. You guys all look the same. And like he said that to me, knowing I was Latina at the time, right? But there's like somewhat of like a it's interesting because you see how people will say things sometimes when they feel more safe with you, not knowing your background, and you unfortunately I think see the true nature of people sometimes before you come out and say that. And it's allowed me to be in a position where I can educate people and I can push back. So I think that there's, I guess, an amount of privilege in that as well, of being able to use that in a way that helps move the needle for people and helps them to illuminate like some of their unconscious bias. But it was interesting because I actually did get the question the other day about like, so Ian or Edgell is a predominantly Black community. And so we were talking with one of the other organizations and they were like, it was really important to funders that that the leadership reflect the community that they serve. How have you handled that? And I was like, what do you mean by that? And they're like, oh, well, because you're white. And I was like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, first I am Latina, but also it's not about me. Like it's almost just as bad to put somebody in the role just because like, and that was how they were kind of saying is they were like, oh, well, we ended up putting this person in this role because we got this feedback that the leader needed to be Black. And so we put this person in the role because of that. And I was like, no, you can't do that. You need to be elevating from the community. Because the person that they put in the role didn't know how to do the job. They had set him up for failure. He had not fundraised in the way they expected. And then they were saying, and then that kind of like reinforces their beliefs, right? And so you need to do it in a way that is authentic and supports the community and sets them up for success. Again, I'm like the boots on the ground. I'm there at the free store, but I try to elevate the neighbors as much as possible. I try to make our board reflect the neighborhood. I try to have the shoppers on the committee. So it's like we have a diverse board representation that is about 75% people of color, and then all of the shoppers have leadership roles within the committee. So that to me is more representative than just we have a figurehead, right?
Right.
And again, I think it's about how you approach it. Like you can't come in, and this was a criticism I had of ENP. I'll just be completely honest. When I first started, is we were very attached to a church, and the church was predominantly white. And so I was like, there is a bit of a white savior complex of you guys saying this is what we think is best. And so that's why we focused more on the neighborhood needs assessments and like letting the neighbors drive it, because the neighbors were telling them one thing and then they were going a different direction with the programming. Like for instance, they saw like I think 2 teenage pregnant women, and then they were like, we need to do a program for teenage pregnant women, and then there was only two of the two of the girls, and then it's like, is this actually what you need? Like you're very focused on this when what they're really telling you is that they don't have trusted adult figures and mentors that can guide them through the college process, right? So being open to that reception of listening, I think, is way more important.
I love that. And I want to give you tremendous credit for calling that out, for really bringing that to light so that they can understand why it's wrong to assume based on the appearance of your community. There's a few things here. One, I want to unpack the fact that, someone had assumed you were white and then was ready to give you an opportunity or hear you out on something. And meanwhile, you're Latina, right? I've actually heard someone say to me before, this is a Black woman, and she was kind of butting heads with somebody who is a part of the LGBTQ plus community, and they were having a conversation around like discrimination. And she said, there's one thing though, Amanda, that is different here. I can't hide that I'm Black. Members from LGBTQ plus, they can identify as such on their terms when they're comfortable, when they feel like they have that support. And she can't. She can't hide the color of her skin. And that really hit me. It kind of goes both ways, right? While you may look white to some people, and that may be an advantage for you in some cases, I'm really proud that you were like, no, I'm Latina, by the way. Like, you didn't just run with that. You called out, this is who I am, and making sure that, hopefully that person realized, like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't assume, next time. But it happens too often. And then when you talk about the situation where someone was hired really based off the color of their skin, I will say, though it happens, I do want to make sure we recognize that hiring diversity does not mean hiring Black, hiring Latina or Hispanic, right, in general, right? It means making sure that you are giving everybody an opportunity, regardless of their background, the color of their skin, how their sexual orientation is identified, right? And giving those people opportunities to apply for jobs and be included in the interview process. And if in fact they are the right they are the right fit for the job, they should not be judged or you rejected because of these things that make them who they are, right? And so in this particular case, unfortunately, it was the opposite. It was hiring someone because of the color of their skin, not because of their actual skill set and qualifications. I want to make sure that those are watching have a very clear understanding of the difference there, because we're
Oh,
even seeing it at the political level, right? With Donald
we're
Trump and the
seeing that
executive orders.
Yeah, because he's trying to say that, because we've done DEI, now we've got all of these unqualified people in roles. That's what he's trying to say. And he's trying to pass this narrative that the only qualified people are white men. And it's like, that's the whole reason that DEI started in the first place, was because it was predominantly white men in roles. And there is an affinity bias when you're hiring. And so you're more likely to hire people that are like you. And thus, people that were very qualified were not getting opportunities for the roles. And in this case, I mean, this guy was great. He just was not, he was a program manager. And they literally said, we've got one Black staff member. We need representation. Let's make program manager CEO. And it's just like, there was no support. He had never done the fundraising piece of it. He had never done the back end administrative. Like, it just set him up for failure. And when they tried to explain their rationale for it, that was their reason. They were like, we got feedback from funders that we didn't have good representation. And I was like, you can have the representation and find somebody that is their skill set and they thrive in that area.
Right.
And I feel like when you do that more kind of like tokenistic, it does, again, set them up for failure. And then it perpetuates the issues. Like, we had that issue in Nashville where the funders after George Floyd were going to only give money to small grassroots Black organizations. And none of those organizations had the infrastructure to support the money that they were sending them. And so the audits didn't pass and things like that. And they were like, see, this is why we don't do this, right? And it's like, you're setting them up for failure, right? Like,
Right.
and then you're trying to reinforce your bias with it. And so if you're going to focus on that representation and that creating access of opportunity, it has to come with the appropriate supports.
I totally agree. And honestly, you're doing a disservice to the people that are, well, no matter what race, gender, they are, you're doing them a disadvantage by putting them in positions that they're not ready for. And it's unfortunate that in this case, this person may have been wanting to get promoted or ready for a promotion, but maybe there wasn't that support that they needed to help get there. And instead, it was, using the color of their skin as a way to move them forward. I want to also kind of not leave out the generational aspect here. So we have younger people, and you are a younger executive. You actually stepped into executive roles at an earlier stage in your career. And so, as we think about how it was for you as a younger executive in your field, what's one challenge that you would say shaped you the most, especially when navigating power dynamics?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of, so this is actually what my first dissertation was on, is age and gender discrimination in the nonprofit sector and how that affects hiring, retention, and upward mobility. There are a lot of misconceptions that people make about age, and there is a lot of like generational beef to a certain extent. And you see this with a lot of people in terms of like, I suffered, so therefore you have to suffer type situation. And so I feel like the boomers are like, I had to grind at this job for 20 years to get promoted to manager, and you've got to do your time too. And so I think there is this misconception of like, oh, they got promoted too fast or they're not ready. I had a lot of people that gave me feedback like, well, I know what I was like at 23. I was out partying at the clubs. And so, that's how you're going to be. And you can't make those kinds of assumptions, right? Like I was working full time since I left at 18, and I was in my doctoral program when I was 23. Like I was never like the one that was going out and doing that type of stuff. It's fine if that's what you want to do in your 20s, but I was very much like grinding all the time. I feel like it was a blessing in terms of being able to really get thrown into the fire and get the experience. Because one of the things that is really a struggle in the nonprofit sector is that it's very difficult to get the skill set of an executive director. An executive director has to have fundraising experience, has to have finance experience, has to have program experience, has to have ops experience. And if you're working in a larger nonprofit, it's very difficult to get that because if you're a program person, you just work in program and maybe you'll talk to the executive director, but you don't get the opportunity to cross train in the other areas. So when it comes to CEO level, boards will say, I need somebody that's been a CEO or I need somebody that's been a COO. But it's very difficult to go from that like coordinator manager level to CEO if you haven't had the opportunity to cross train. And so I feel like that's the only reason that I have been successful is because I was given the opportunity to be an executive director at a small shop where I got to do all the things and build that skill set. And so I really focus on how can I do that for other people? How can I create those opportunities for them to shadow other roles so that they are set up for success? Again, going back to the other thing, if you've only worked in programs, it's very difficult to step into the CEO role and build those skill sets on the fly, especially in an organization that doesn't have stability, right? So if you're in a small shop, there's a lot of pressure on you to jump in and immediately start fundraising and immediately start going because a lot of these small organizations, they're growing very rapidly. And so it takes somebody in that role that can like hit the ground running and be really aggressive in fundraising because they've got a high run rate. And so if you don't fundraise quickly, they could shut down, in 6 months. And that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody that's new to that role. So when you're elevating somebody in a larger organization, they have a lot more of the opportunity to learn, and to have some time and take a year or so to really build that infrastructure. And that's just not a luxury that I feel like you have in the small shops. I did do a panel on managing cross-generational workforce teams. And a lot of the boomers say that they feel like millennials are entitled and they want to move up too quickly. And I'm like, I think that it's not necessarily that, but it's like there is this mindset of continuous progression. So that doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, I'm going to go program staff to CEO, but am I going to go program staff to team lead? Or am I going to get to take on new projects? Or like, you don't necessarily have to be giving raises every year, but are they being able to increase some responsibility? Are they being able to take point on a project by themselves? Because again, if there's not that opportunity for personal development, I think it's hard to keep them engaged and feeling like they're being invested in. And so it's easy for them to just go somewhere else.
Yeah, and another great set of points that you touched on here You don't have to have 20 years of experience compared to someone who's a bit younger, maybe who has relevant experience, but just not from a tenure perspective. The first thing that really comes to mind, even outside of your example, is our president of the Alpha Phoenix chapter that I sit on the board for. She's young and reserved. She doesn't like to go out and party very much. She's married. She is a hard worker. She actually works for Nationwide and works very closely with their executive team as their diversity consultant, recruiting partner. She does a lot. And on top of all of that is the president of our Alpha Phoenix chapter, and I believe the youngest chapter president in Alpha. And so when you look at people like you who kind of started off that way and her, being in that stage right now, I don't even know people who have 20 years plus more of experience that can do what she can do or what you can do, right? So those are just a few examples. And then when it comes to the cross training perspective, I think that is why rotational programs are so important. And I'm not talking about just for students who are looking at internships and going through rotational programs. I'm talking about entry, mid-level, senior leaders being able to experience different parts of the organization. That's so important because one, you're increasing the chances of exciting the people that work there because they get to do different things and they get to learn a variety of skills. But also it gives them something new to look forward to, so that way they don't feel like they have to job hop to find something else that's new, or you can also assess their pay, right, and kind of understand, like, are you at the right pay based on your position and experience. There's a lot of things that people can do with their existing employees to help put them in situations where they can gain new skills and train cross-functionally. And to your point about entitlement for millennials, so I'm a millennial myself, and I can absolutely relate. I started off in my career working for companies for a longer period of time, anywhere between like 3 to 5 years. That was a long time for me, at least. I know 20 years and, more is kind of what you see more from the baby boomer generation. But I was on that path. And also, I was at a period where I didn't feel like I could be my authentic self. I felt like people were trying to mold me into a leader that I didn't really want to be. And so I finally started to really do what was best for me, and that was advocating for myself. First and foremost, recognizing that I'm a servant leader and servant leadership looks different than the traditional leader. I decided that, I wanted to start a journey at one organization, and I did really well, but then my growth stalled, right? And so I'm like, I'm not going to sit around here and wait to be promoted or wait for something to happen when I know my skills can be used elsewhere, or I know that I deserve more pay for the type of work that I'm doing and for the experience and the skills that I've gained to this point. I don't view that as entitlement. I view that as empowerment. I'm empowering myself to make these decisions that are best for my career, especially if the employer that I'm working at is not on the same page as me when it comes to that. I also think that is why there's an importance of multifaceted executives. I wanted to make sure that this was a space where executives could come and share their wisdom, right? Through their stories, their insights, and all the transferable skills that they've learned along the way. And so thank you for doing that here with us today and for sharing your story, and telling us a little bit more about yourself. Okay, so when we think about what do we want our audience to take away from this conversation, we've talked around, collaborating over competition. We've talked about how that impacted you in the nonprofit space. We've talked a lot about diversity and paying attention to, what the needs are of the people that you're serving and not jumping to assumptions or resulting to stereotypes to lead, but also calling out when things like this happen. You've done an excellent job at that. Something else that you've mentioned to me before that I would really love for you to kind of share more about is, let's talk push versus pull communication, because communication is a big piece to how you can show up as a leader and navigate these kind of things. And so what have you learned about inspiring versus directing, and what that distinction is, and why it's so critical in leadership.
Yeah. Um, so on the empowerment piece, you have to realize, I think employers at this point need to realize that every employee has other options now, right? Like entrepreneurship is a big thing, creating is a big thing. There's opportunities for people to go and do their own thing. So I do think that employers have to work 10 times as hard to make the case for why it is fun and exciting and engaging to be part of the team. Like, if I can work for myself, what entices me to work for you and be a part of this culture? And I think it's much easier. Again, it used to be I need to stay here for longevity. I need to work my career here. I need to have loyalty to this company. I don't feel like there's that same mindset. So if an employee feels disrespected, if they feel like they're not part of the culture, if they feel like there's not value in showing up to work every day, then they can just go somewhere else, right? And so I do think that employees or employers really have to double down on what makes something useful. And so one of the things that I've found really awesome is doing individual development plans with every employee. So as soon as they come on, where do you want to go in this role? Where do you want to go in your career? Right? Because ideally, you don't want somebody to be with your company forever. You want to be able to set them up to where they can go on to bigger and better things eventually. A lot of people that work with me want to be a CEO one day. So I'm not threatened by that. I want to make sure that they have that skill set. And so I'll say, do you need help in grant writing? Do you need help in program evaluation? How do we create, like, I had one team member that we did weekly grant writing coaching, and she would draft a first round and then I would go through it with her. And she was like, that's great. Cause like I would have never gotten the experience to do grant writing in the role that I'm in, which for her was like affordable housing coordinator. And so I do think that employers have to think about that and think about how each team member kind of fits in and how we can both motivate their growth within the company, but also help develop them as career professionals. Push versus pull communication. So I would say, I mentioned like maybe it was too early for me to be an executive when I was early because I was very, I guess I felt like I needed to prove like my worth and why I belonged there and that I knew what I was doing. I would come into nonprofits and I would be like, what you're doing is wrong. It's not in compliance. You got to get in compliance, da 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 da. And even though they probably didn't know, right? Like, again, a lot of people start nonprofits, they have no experience in like what nonprofits do or even all of the compliance stuff, especially when you're small. You don't necessarily like have the guidebook of what, like, they're operating under 50,000, they're filling out the Form 990 postcard every year. Like, they never really get into the nitty gritty of like the nonprofit compliance rules because they're not really large enough to like be bound by it, if that makes sense. And so there's rarely intentional malfeasance. A lot of it is just like ignorance and like not knowing how it works. And so I came in thinking I was being helpful and saying like, no, 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 this is how you do it and you got to get in compliance. And that immediately like put them off. They're like, how dare you
Right.
come in and like assume that we're doing something wrong? And so I tried that a few times and it always like made the relationship with the board a lot more tenuous too, because the board is technically your boss, right? So you're going in and you're telling your boss, hey, you don't know what you're doing. And that's not a good way to like start the relationship. And then I feel like I overcorrected with one and I like tried to be really accommodating for like 6 months to try to build that rapport before I dropped the here's what you're not doing right. And then it was like, oh, I feel like you 180'd on me because everything was cool until you dropped this thing 6 months in. And so I was like, okay, there's got to be a better way to do this. That's where I learned. I took a workshop on executive presence. And so she was talking about push versus pull communication. And pull communication is more like, how do you motivate and inspire people to do what you want versus telling them what needs to be done? And so a lot of times I've now shifted to more of that education piece, like, hey, this is like my area, and were you aware that this is, typically how it's run? I could understand why you like set it up like this. Best practice is XYZ. Do you have some questions about that? Like, really leading from more of like a point of curiosity than accusation, and focusing on educating as well, I think has helped with like building the rapport and ultimately like making them more invested in like elevating to that point of compliance and excellence.
Yeah. You know, I'm really glad that you touched on this and you shared more about what you learned on push versus pull communication because I think we're all guilty of it first and foremost. No matter how much we want to build rapport and build relationships and, establish a good rhythm to these conversations that we're having with people, but I think it's the awareness piece that's important. As long as you're aware that, okay, hold on, I mean, this is not the right approach. Let me take a step back. And you did that, you recognize this is not working and you kind of switched up a few times in terms of your communication. And I commend you for that because some people will just continue doing it even if it doesn't work. And I'm guilty of it myself, I should say, because yeah, I could be very direct. And so I have to watch out for that when I speak to different people who don't appreciate someone that is as direct. And so with that, and then also just I'm very ambitious. And so I love to share ideas and stuff. And, I've received feedback before where, someone felt like I was prioritizing my ideas over theirs. And that wasn't my intention. But I think because I'm so ambitious and so direct, it may come off that way sometimes. As long as we can kind of take a step back and realize, okay, hold up. Let's try to make sure that we're really embracing other people's ideas here and not just, my own. And I was able to do that. And, it's something that I've corrected moving forward. But we have to be able to kind of reflect in those times and understand where we can pivot to build better relationships. And I really appreciate you touching on this because it's so important with executives. The way that we communicate and how we pull people into the conversations is very important, right? And I think what's worked for me too is asking people, why are you doing this way? What context would help me understand why that has been the approach? And what outcomes has that led to? Are you seeing the outcomes that you desire based on this approach that you've been taking? No? Okay. Are you open to a discussion on how we can maybe come up with a different approach together? Using that kind of language pulls people in versus pushes them away to focus on your agenda. So, thank you so much for sharing that. I also think it's important that people have sponsors because sponsors help you see things like this that you don't see, or rather, mentors that turn into sponsors, right? They see your potential, they see the things that you're doing, but they want to help you as well along the way. So that way they feel comfortable when it comes down to it to actually like recommend you for promotions or speak your name when you're not in that room, right? So you've highlighted the importance of sponsorship, especially for underrepresented leaders in previous conversations you and I have had. So what, from your perspective, does powerful sponsorship look like? And how can more of us show up in that way for others?
Yeah, I mean, I think my mentality is always when I'm in a room looking at what are the voices that are represented in this room, because often there is not a lot of diversity and representation in especially like funding rooms, or you'll notice at like certain networking events, like who's getting invited to the table. And so I always try to say like, who can I invite to this table that may not have gotten an opportunity at this table had I not like opened a door? And so I try to look at people that I know have a lot of potential that may be experiencing barriers. There's a lot of people, women I talk to right now that they keep getting to like the top two and then not getting the final callback. And I think they're getting a lot of like biased language in the feedback that they're getting of like, oh, women are not assertive enough, or, I'm trying
All
not,
the things that
I'm
they
trying to
say.
work on my language.
No, don't worry about that. This is how we show up authentically. Like we're not reading scripts here, people.
Yeah.
We are truly coming to you with our most honest and valuable thoughts and experiences. So we totally see where you're going.
Yeah, but the BS that you see
Yes.
that
Yes.
women get at that level. And like, I mean, that first role that I got, I was told, well, we're lucky we caught you before you started popping out babies. Like that's the type of stuff that women get when they're trying to go for executive roles. And it's just ridiculous. And then same thing, like I told them that they were disrespectful because they sent me a meme of R. Kelly crying in response to an email that I sent them. And they said, this is why women are so emotional. Like I could joke around with the guys and they wouldn't have been bothered by that. And it's just like, and it's like I knew that I couldn't say anything because the second I say something, that's going to be the reason, you know? And so I try my best to, yeah, figure out who's not at the table. How can I create those pathways? How can I illuminate when I'm in rooms? Those conversations about like representation and what value, like especially at the board level for nonprofits, like I focus on the diversity matrix, so not just racial, gender, age, but also like what networks are they in, what skill sets do they have. It's a diversity of all sorts of skill sets and pockets of influence, not just like the representation piece. And so I think for me, one of the most powerful like sponsorships that I've received was the Association of Fundraising Professionals has a Women's Impact Initiative leadership development program. And I got paired with a mentor, and she has been one of the best examples of what I would consider a sponsor. So, like, she's writing letters of recommendation, she's tagging me in LinkedIn posts, she's sending me job opportunities she sees. She's, hey, I just got this consulting client that I can't handle. How about you? I think it's creating those opportunities where you are creating a network of people and knowing what their kind of like areas of strength are, and then saying, oh, this would be a perfect opportunity for them. How can I make that happen? And being willing to put your name on the line to make that happen. Because I've seen that this is where like a lot of like DEI conversations have fallen apart in the past, as I've been on boards where they're like, we want to be super anti-racist. And so they go through a whole anti-racist training and they're like, yeah, this sounds great. This sounds great. And they're like, okay, well, when you release this anti-racist purpose statement, you're probably going to lose some of your Republican legislators that have been sponsoring your legislations that you're trying to pass. Are you okay with that? I mean, isn't that kind of contrary to what we're trying to do? So maybe we be anti-racist in in theory, but not outward, right? And I feel like sponsorship is the same thing. Like you have to be willing to go like 10 toes down for the people that you're trying to sponsor, and be willing to like really fiercely advocate for why they deserve to be in the role.
Right. Yeah. And oftentimes it's not just because they fall under an underrepresented category, too, right? Like, let's recognize the fact that you can sponsor people that come from any background, and you shouldn't be sponsoring someone just because of the color of their skin. But again, pulling them into opportunities where they can be sponsored or they can showcase
They're
their
super qualified.
accomplishments.
Yeah, they're super qualified, but it's about helping them with overcoming the bias that often happens at those higher
Right.
levels.
And you know what's interesting to me is I think that if companies or leaders of these companies rather stopped focusing on what can we say to make it appear like we're not racist or we have a lot of diversity or whatever the case is, to actions. So if you and the leaders at the organization are taking action and showing up for everyone in your community and not making comments like they made to you, being, oh, well, this is how it is with women, I can go talk to my guys, like, okay, fine, go do that. But if that kind of language and communication, rather, is being embraced or accepted, then you're already showing through the actions of the leaders that you have brought onto this company that this is okay. And now you're going to turn other people away. And now more women or more people from diverse backgrounds are not going to be wanting to work with you because they see what you allow to happen. And then are quick to go to their PR person or whoever and say, hey, we want to make sure that we are a company that appears inclusive to women and all these other people. But if your actions are not reflective of that, then it doesn't really matter what statement you put out there or how you handle that from a communications or PR perspective. People are going to see through it. And when we talked about the generational aspect before, like we have a very diverse generation out there in the workforce. We have baby boomers, we have millennials, we have Gen Z, right? We have all of these generations and they all hold different perspectives. And some of these leaders and companies just have to make sure that they're staying in touch with what do these different generations need and how do they actually, what do they look for in companies when they're trying to join. And I will tell you right now, a company that puts a statement out there that says we're not, an anti-racist statement, that doesn't do me anything. Especially if I go to your website and I see a bunch of white males, maybe even a few females here and there, and no type of diversity. Like that just tells me either one, people don't want to work for you that come from these backgrounds, and for whatever those reasons are, or two, you're not intentional about making sure that you have a diverse pipeline of candidates. And again, not just because of the color of their skin or their gender or any of that, but because these people are actually qualified and want to be working at this company. So you've touched on great points there, especially also when we think about the sponsorship perspective. Thank you so much, Allison. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I want to know, how can people connect with you after this?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, Allison Quintanilla Platzmeyer. I also have AQP Nonprofit Consulting on Instagram and Facebook. And then ENP is Empowering NP on Instagram and Facebook.
Awesome. Okay, so you heard where to connect with Allison. Thank you again for such an insightful discussion, Allison. 2 weeks from now, I interview our next guest speaker. She's a Fortune 500 executive from Wall Street who shares a unique perspective on health and wellness for executives. So make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on LinkedIn, download the podcast series on Spotify. And until then, thanks for listening to the Multifaceted Executive Podcast, where each episode reminds us that leadership looks different from every seat at the table.